Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to join us. So welcome. We are in Coalition's monthly security webinar, and today we're excited to talk about a really critical topic, which is how to secure your business email. We all probably are far too used to business email as a critical communication tool for personal use, for work as well. It's become that much more important in the pandemic with remote work and remote collaboration. And we're excited to talk a little bit more about best practices for how you can secure your email from threats and from vulnerable activity and ensure that you protect your business overall, because email, for better or worse, can be a critical gateway for hackers to break way into your organization and can result in significant exposure for policyholders. I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Aaron Kraus, who is a security engagement lead here at Coalition. He is a cybersecurity practitioner and educator with over 15 years of experience in the industry. He holds a CISSP and CCSP designations, and he is a critical resource here at Coalition to our broker partners and to our policyholders to understand how they can best secure their operations. And so we're really excited to have him here today to talk about email security and, again, what organizations can do to ensure they stay secure. So a quick note on Zoom before we kick off. You should see at the bottom of your screen, there are two different controls that enable you to submit questions. There's the chat button and the Q&A feature. And we'll be taking questions throughout the presentation. We'll also have some time at the end for Q&A. So please feel free to submit those questions. And thanks to you who also shared some questions before the presentation as well. So a quick note about who we are. We're excited to be welcoming a broad group of our broker partners and policyholders today. So first of all, thank you for placing your trust in Coalition and for partnering with us in managing your cybersecurity and your cyber risk. We're the fastest growing provider of cyber insurance and security solutions in the US and in Canada. And we think about cyber risk and risk management differently than the rest of the industry. And I think that this presentation is really going to showcase that. We obviously provide insurance as a critical, financial backstop and as a way to recover if the worst happens to your organization. But we also think very critically about how we can best set up our policyholders and our broker partners to prevent themselves from being a target in the first place. And this presentation on email security is going to really highlight how we think about setting up those proactive controls to stay secure. We're going to talk through a few different topics today. So first, Aaron's going to walk through our cybersecurity guide, which is a resource that we published at the end of last year, which has all of our sort of most critical security recommendations that we suggest organizations of all size implement to stay secure. Then we're going to talk about email security, which is one of the items on that list and is our topic for today's discussion. We're then going to talk about a case study that has been making headlines over the past couple of weeks, which is a critical vulnerability in Microsoft Exchange. We're going to talk a little bit about what happened, what some of our remediation recommendations and actions have been, and how we recommend organizations learn from this to protect their emails going forward. And then finally, we'll have some time at the end for dedicated Q&A. So with that, I'm excited to turn it over to my colleague, Aaron.
Thanks so much, Jen. And looks like we tried to double unmute there. Thank you, Jen. And it's great to welcome everyone. Going to have two firsts in this webinar when we get to the case study. As Jen mentioned as well, we do have open chat as well as Q&A. I have that open, so if you have a question about anything that I'm talking about as we go through, please feel free to post it. I can either answer it then, or if it makes sense, a couple slides from then, I'll let you know that as well. I'd like to start off first by highlighting the 2021 Coalition Cybersecurity Guide. And Jen, if you can go over to the next slide, you'll see here 10 of our recommendations, 9 plus actually a bonus here, basically that are prioritized and into a hierarchy of things that we think our policyholders can do that will have the most impact to their cybersecurity programs, that will have the most return on investment, if you want to put it in business terms, related to what we think of as cyber hygiene. So increasing the security of your organization. Right up there at the top, we have two that deal with email security. Obviously, increasing email security using some of the specifics that we're going to talk about. And then the second one, implementing multi-factor authentication, also largely lumped into email security. Because email is a critical gateway to the outside world, and because it is often remotely accessible, which you'll see secure remote access is also on our list of to-do items, multi-factor authentication helps to protect that externally exposed, remotely accessible resource that is email. Multi-factor authentication basically means instead of just a username and password, you have to enter your password as well as something else, a code generated by a hardware token, those little keychain fobs you might have seen, or by a smartphone app. That basically helps to ensure even if something goes wrong in one way, a user falls for a phishing scheme, or they write down a password and it gets stolen, that stolen password will not be useful to the attackers. Given the critical role that email plays, implementing multi-factor authentication, particularly for email, is one of those critical recommendations. Real quickly to run through the remainder of the recommendations, not all of them necessarily have to do with email, but good to mention for better cyber hygiene awareness, making sure that you have data backups. One of the things that we'll talk about a little bit later, email is often the entry point for attackers into a network, and then they do other malicious stuff. They implement ransomware, which basically holds your files and your data hostage. You have to pay to unlock it, but if you have a valid backup of that data, you can simply ignore the ransomed files and grab the data from your backup. Keeping software up to date is also important, and we're going to see why that is when we talk about the case study. Microsoft has announced that there are vulnerabilities in Exchange. Patching them is the critical to-do item to move forward and to make sure that you are protected. Making sure that you're also keeping track of passwords using a password manager, or making sure that you are looking for any malicious software running on your network, making sure you have antivirus or anti-malware software, as it used to be known, now evolving to be called endpoint detection and response. Basically, if someone does breach your defenses, this is a secondary control that can help you to identify that breach has occurred and help you correct it. And as I mentioned, there's a bonus here, purchasing cyber insurance. Obviously, we put that there for two reasons. Cyber insurance is a product that Coalition sells, but it's also a key part of a risk management strategy. Having cyber insurance allows you to not only transfer risk, if something does go wrong, obviously your insurance carrier can help you with the claim, but because all of these risks are pooled together, we actually have aligned incentives to help improve the security for policyholders. So this is especially great for those small or medium-sized businesses who are very focused on operations, not so much on security. They gain access to a wealth of resources through their insurance carrier that otherwise they might not even know exist, or that might be priced a little bit too high to be really accessible. I see a question. Michael, I'm going to ask you to hold off on that until we get to talking about the Exchange vulnerability particularly. I will answer that question on a slide. To get us there quicker, Jen, can I ask us to go on to the next slide? So laying the foundation here, what is it that we're talking about? Why do we focus on securing email? Being in the industry, I know this. This is something that I, however, have to tell people who are not in IT or not in security. Email is not a secure form of communication. When you send an email, it is possible for the contents of that message to be read and intercepted, if they're intercepted, in transit. Unfortunately, we use email pretty much for everything nowadays. I've started emailing back and forth, even with family members, rather than picking up the phone and talking to them, because we all have busy lives. Obviously, huge amounts of business are conducted in email as well. From Coalition's claims data, we saw that an attack known as business email compromise, which is exactly what it sounds like, a user's business email is compromised in some way. BEC was the initial point of entry for 54% of our claims. So business email compromise in and of itself can be a cyber attack, which rises to the level of a claim, or it can be the entry point that causes further malicious actions. A user's email is compromised, That email account is then used to gain access to other resources. Might not seem immediately obvious, but if you think about it, when you do a password reset, where does that password reset come? It usually comes in the form of an email that you click on a link and reset a password. If I want to take over someone's accounts payable system, the easiest way to do that, probably steal someone's email, log into their email as them, and then request password resets for those other systems. So to point number one on the previous slide, protecting and securing your email, there are a host of acronyms, a little cybersecurity alphabet soup related to email security. Three main technologies known as SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. These are all technologies designed to make it much harder for people to spoof or pretend to be you, to send emails that look like they come from you. Oftentimes, when we talk about business email compromise, there is also a third-party compromise. Someone's vendor is compromised, typically through email, and then that compromise is used to attack another organization to send fraudulent payment redirections, funds transfer frauds, fake invoices, and the like. So implementing these tools can make it a little bit easier for fraudulent emails to be spotted. If you have SPF, DKIM, and DMARC properly enabled, the people with whom you are transacting business over email, their email programs will actually be able to make some decisions about whether or not an email they've received is fraudulent or is legitimate. Of course, because we have remote access and we need access controls for email, we also talk here about multi-factor authentication, making sure that access to email requires more than just a username and a password. Username, password, plus clicking a prompt on a smartphone or entering a code from an app. Couple of recommendations for securing email, particularly around the choice of what's known as a hosting provider or a vendor. Going with some of the big, well-recognized names is a good way to get more robust security. Obviously, it's easier than trying to do this for yourself. Both Google and Microsoft have literally thousands of engineers on staff, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of security folks on staff. So an email hosting provider like Google Workspace, previously known as Google Apps for Business, or G Suite, as well as Microsoft 365, previously known as Office 365, going with one of those providers will give you some automatic security benefits. And to the question that was asked a little bit earlier, Michael, Office 365 as an email service actually meant that you were not affected by the recently announced Exchange vulnerabilities. Microsoft was aware of the vulnerability and was able to mitigate it for all of their Microsoft 365 customers. It's only those folks who are hosting their own email server. Saw another question that came in, great one. What do SPF, DKIM, and DMARC stand for? SPF, not Sun Protection Factor. This is Sender Policy Framework. Basically, when you are sending emails, it's a framework for what is and what is not allowed. DKIM and DMARC both deal with verifying what's known as your email domain. So DKIM, domain keys integrity. DMARC deals with message authenticity reporting and conformance, domain message authenticity reporting and conformance. Rather complex terms. Basically, to boil it down, they provide specificity for who is allowed to send email on your behalf from your domain and who is not. Another great question, what is MFA? What does it stand for? Multi-factor authentication. So more than one factor, more than just a password is needed to log into a resource. Going back to the discussion about the email hosting providers, there are also security hosting providers that can be used. These are known as mail proxies. A couple of vendors here, Proofpoint and Mimecast, are examples. Basically, they proxy your email traffic. So they sit in between you and the outside world and perform security scanning of both inbound and outbound messages. So implementing one of those can be a good way to increase the security around email as well. Great question, Larry. Is sending email using TLS completely safe? Nothing is completely safe. Sending email using TLS implements encryption, so the contents of your messages are confidential. They are safe. They are unlikely to be intercepted and read in transit. However, it does not mean that the emails you send are legitimate. If someone takes over one of your users' inboxes, they will send an email. It will still be encrypted using that TLS. However, the contents of the message may be malicious. It may be an Office document with a malicious macro. It may be a malicious request for some funds transfer fraud. So completely safe is a very dangerous thing to say. It is a good security measure, however. Lots going on here. Jen, next slide. Continuing on the foundation, what we saw last year in terms of claim from the coalition claims report that we released, more than half of the claims that we saw resulted from an email intrusion. So again, a compromised email was the point of entry that led to a further breach. So you can see that here on the pie chart. It is the biggest section here. 54% of our claims, ultimate root cause was an email or a phishing campaign. Many of the 3% that you see for third-party compromise also fall into that category. In this case, a third party was compromised through their email. Some of the social engineering in there, that 6% also could potentially have some crossover. So that pie chart could actually be made into a very complex Venn diagram. Basically, the critical role that email plays in business nowadays also makes it a critical target for attackers. Unfortunately, we also saw a rise in claims related to email due to the increasing use of email to support remote work. Questions, business processes that previously would have been handled by walking down the hall and tapping someone on the shoulder, that information was now being exchanged via email. Processes were being done remotely. So between 2019 and 2020, we actually did see a significant increase, 67% in the frequency of business email compromise attacks. And that was for the first half of 2020. So obviously only 1 quarter worth of pandemic-driven remote work. That number continued to increase throughout the year. Next slide, please, Jen. One interesting fact, and I want to be very careful with how I present this, not all email is created equal. Based on Coalition's claims data, we actually see organizations using Microsoft 365 are a little more than 3 times as likely to experience a business email compromise when compared to policyholders and claims data that we see for users on Google Workspace. Very clearly want to state this. We are not saying that Microsoft 365 is insecure. I'll say it again, Microsoft 365 is not necessarily more secure than Google Workspace. From an attacker's point of view, using Microsoft 365 gives some interesting insight, some interesting intelligence that attackers can use to make further guesses needed to continue their attack. For one, Microsoft 365 is often a migration path from hosting your own Exchange, hosting your own email services for larger organizations. So those organizations, obviously, deeper pockets, they're going to inherently be more likely to suffer an attack. As an attacker, I might also make some educated guesses. If I can see that you are using Microsoft 365, and that is information that I can figure out using publicly available data, I can also make some guesses like you might be using the Microsoft Office suite of tools. If anyone is familiar with Microsoft Office macros, you know that those are little programs, scripts, which can be attached to Excel spreadsheets, to PowerPoints, to Word documents. Those can do some really cool things like data formatting or mail merging. They can also be used for malicious activity. They can be used for compromise. If I know you're using Microsoft 365, I take an educated guess that you have Microsoft Office. I'm going to send you an email with a malicious Office document that has a macro. That's just going to be something that I can do because of the information that is available publicly. Those are educated guesses I can make. I've seen a couple of questions that I wanted to save for this because they all kind of related to that. Does utilizing Office 365 limit the attack? Does it offer any additional protections? So there was a question as well. If you're using the advanced protection for Office 365, do you need to implement something like Mimecast or Proofpoint. The question will always be, unfortunately, it depends. It depends on the type of organization that you are. It depends on the type of traffic that is coming in through email. It depends on what your business processes look like. If you are exchanging sensitive information, if you are exchanging business critical information, things like invoices or requests for directing payment, if that information is being done via email, Microsoft Advanced Protection, great to implement, should be available for many of you, depending on which Microsoft 365 licenses you have. To the question about Proofpoint or Mimecast or other tools, it will again depend on what kind of business you're doing in your email. If you are exchanging files with a limited number of outside parties, just a few business partners, a tool like that might be a little bit overkill. If you are routinely transacting with totally unknown people, random members of the public can email you and ask for services or send you information, a more robust solution would be appropriate. Less of a question and more of an addition I saw from Laura, great point there, using things like DMARC, DKIM, and SPF policies definitely help. That's why we highlight it. You can also block scripting in Microsoft. You can block macros from being run in Microsoft Office. That's another great security tool. Like all security, however, that involves a trade-off between security and functionality. Blocking those macros means if people need to use them for functional operational purposes, obviously they won't be able to do it. So we talk a lot about cost-benefit analysis. Jen, can we move on to the next slide? I said I was going to do two things that I've never done in a webinar before, and those two things are this. Number one, to present a case study on a current evolving issue. Case studies are usually after an issue has been done, after we've done the root cause analysis, after we've looked back at the activities. This is still an ongoing security issue that we are not only helping our policyholders deal with, but that in the larger InfoSec cybersecurity community is obviously taking a lot of free time. The other thing that I've never done is to encourage people, if you know that you are running your own Exchange server and you cannot answer definitively that it has been updated and patched, I would encourage you to step away from the webinar and go get your IT folks on the phone and make sure that you are taking care of this immediately. The vulnerability is that severe. I would rather have you watch this recording than have a vulnerable Exchange server sitting out exposed to the internet much longer. Assuming most of you are not doing that, quick breakdown of what the actual vulnerability was here, what it is that is causing so much consternation. The what is an exploitation of for Exchange, Microsoft Exchange Server, email, contact, and calendaring software, exploitation of 4 vulnerabilities in that server software, which give access to what's known as a reverse shell. Basically, it gives the attackers the way to a way to take administrative control of an Exchange server and do whatever they wish with that Exchange server. Where does this occur? It occurs in Microsoft Exchange Server versions 2013, 2016, and 2019 that are being hosted dedicated for a specific organization. And that can either be on your own premises, that's where the expression on-prem comes from. This could also be hosted on your behalf. So if you have a third party, like a managed service provider running your dedicated Exchange server, this does still impact you. The only things that are not vulnerable, Exchange Online and the Microsoft 365 products. So if you made the migration to Office 365, if you know that you're using Microsoft 365, this is not something you need to worry about. Quick timeline here. When did this occur? The attacks appear to have occurred. The vulnerability was initially discovered around sometime between December and February. The best data that I've seen that I would support is that Microsoft possibly became aware of this sometime in mid-January to early February. The most important date, however, is that Microsoft publicly announced not only the vulnerability, but also the active exploitation that they were seeing on March 2nd, so a few weeks ago. The reason for the lag time, obviously Microsoft doesn't want to tip their hand and say there is a vulnerability in our software until they had time to prepare a patch. So that is why there was a little bit of lag time there. Great question in here from Laura, or actually a point. This also includes hybrid servers. So if you are in a hybrid setup between on-prem and Microsoft 365, in that case, you do still have an on-prem Exchange server running one of those versions, but you also have Exchange running in Microsoft 365. So a good point of nuance to make sure your IT folks are on top of. Jen, if we can move on to the next slide, we'll talk about some of the details related to the vulnerability. I always like to make sure I answer the question, so what? Why is this important? When Microsoft announced the vulnerability, they also announced that a Chinese nation-state hacking group called Hafnium was actively targeting Exchange servers. And the most recent data that I've seen is that about 60,000 or more organizations have been hit by this, meaning their Exchange servers have been compromised. This includes some very high-value targets, which you would expect a nation-state attacker to go after. The European banking regulator and Norwegian parliament are two high-profile examples that have had data compromises, security breaches related to this particular vulnerability. That was the initial wave of announcements. This is an evolving issue, an evolving problem. By the week of March 8th, so a little under 7 days after Microsoft announced the vulnerability, the exploits became what we call in the industry weaponized. Basically, the attackers had an automated way to make use of these vulnerabilities to take over an Exchange server. The reason here, of course, being some type of motivation. In this case, typically going after sensitive information. Our email servers contain a lot of details. We do a lot of stuff via email. Email servers are also typically placed in a position that would allow further access into a network. So they are public facing. Obviously, we send and receive email outside of the network, but information also needs to make its way into the network. Emails need to be delivered to a user's inbox or browser when they're sitting on their computer inside the network, so they can be used as an access point. They can also be used to do what is known as pivoting, so gaining access to other systems. The Exchange server itself is a foothold. Once the attacker has established access, they then pivot and target other systems, possibly to deploy ransomware, possibly to try and take over, deploy other reverse shells, whatever they feel like doing inside your network. A couple things to know about the motivations of cyber attackers, and one of the reasons that we're talking about this. Some attacks are targeted. So as we saw with Hafnium, going after things like banking regulators and legislative bodies, those are going after high-value targets. Some other examples from the past included Stuxnet and the Petya malware, which targeted nuclear research and energy sectors with the goal of disrupting the operations of those sectors. Most organizations will not be targeted in this manner. Quite simply, we're just not important enough to be targeted. We are not a country-level legislative body or an energy provider for tens of millions of people. However, once these attacks become weaponized, they can then be automated. So this is sort of a scattershot approach. Attackers can actually use automated tools to go after these vulnerabilities to attempt to gain access wherever they can. This is purely opportunistic. They may not even have a motive for breaching you. They may be seeing what they can breach. Based on what they are able to breach, they then figure out if they can do anything with it. If not, they may move on to another target. Unfortunately, what we also see is that oftentimes they will breach a target. There's nothing of value currently, but they will drop what is known as a loader. So this is essentially a placeholder that can be activated in the future to download malware if a new vulnerability is discovered. And again, this can all be done using automated tools and has also largely benefited from technologies like artificial intelligence, which make these types of attacks easier and unfortunately much more profitable. Next slide, please, Jen. We'll get into our recommendations for what to do about this. Very, very technical recommended remediations. This is, of course, being recorded. If you would like to screenshot this and send it to your IT folks to make sure that they're doing these things, that would be fine as well. Of course, make sure that you have patched your servers right away. Confusingly, Microsoft has two types of patches for Exchange. There are what are known as cumulative updates, as well as the security patches that deal with this particular vulnerability. You need to have both of those at the most current level in order to be secure. There was also mention, I believe somewhere in the Q&A, of a Microsoft one-click mitigation tool. Your tech folks will know where to find that in the Microsoft knowledge base. It can help you to not only take care of the vulnerability, but also importantly, will tell you if there is any evidence that you have been victimized by this breach, if there's any evidence of attackers making use of it. Some other broader recommendations include filtering outbound traffic as well as restricting traffic to only authorized hosts. There are known what are called command and control servers that malware uses for data exfiltration. Basically, attackers steal data off of your systems and send it to these known servers for collection. Blocking traffic to those servers at your firewall level is a very effective way of preventing an attack from being successful. They might be able to get in, but they can't get any data back out. Similarly, restricting internet access to authorized sources, preventing people from making connections to countries or known malicious actors, or restricting access, if possible, to only those resources that people actually need to be interacting with. Of course, Coalition provides claims as well as incident response support. So if you believe that you have been compromised, or if you need help with any of these aspects or any other cybersecurity aspects, you can always reach out to us. CERT, SIRT at coalitioninc.com gets you in touch with our security incident response team. And finally, if you have been compromised, if you are going through the migration and mitigation process, we recommend that you rebuild your Exchange server. So start from scratch, brand new, clean slate, making sure that anything malicious has been removed, because it would not be there as part of your image. A couple of general Exchange best practices: patch early and patch often. We have seen a couple of folks who said, oh, I'm going to wait and see if this patch is successful. This is a patch for a vulnerability so secure that accidentally taking your Exchange server offline would actually be preferable to suffering an attack. And of course, as we've seen for many organizations, there are strong business indications and business reasons to move to cloud hosting like Microsoft 365. If you need the oomph, if you need the business case justification, vulnerabilities like this and the scramble to deal with them is definitely a strong data point to include in that justification. Couple of questions that came in here. How does filtering outgoing email get done? Scott, that is a great question. You can do that in a couple of ways. You can block certain domains. You can also block certain recipients. That's actually a very complex topic, so don't have an easy answer, but definitely happy to follow up with some additional resources after. And Jesse, unfortunately, Coalition does not have a recommended deny list or blacklist. There are publicly available sources like that. I do know that Google, Cloudflare, a couple of other network providers do serve those types of resources. On to the next slide, Jen. I think we can get to talking about what happens if there is an email compromise. So making sure that people are aware of the services that are part of cyber insurance. So the goal of having cyber insurance is, of course, to help you course correct if something does go wrong, to help get things back to normal. That can include helping with services as well as coverage for forensics and breach response, costs needed to perform the forensic investigation, to do any types of customer notification, or costs associated with credit monitoring if privacy information happens to have been breached, as well as costs associated with cyber extortion. Extortion if your files are held for ransom, if your email server is held for ransom, obviously there may be a financial impact. Because email is a business critical tool, business interruption as well as some additional incident related expenses may also be covered. If you are unable to transact business for a certain period of time, that counts as business interruption. That can be covered under a security policy. On to the next slide, Jen. I believe we have 3 more items for insurance coverage before we get on to open Q&A. Recovering from an incident can cost quite a bit. There can be quite a few things that you need to do. So attorneys, public relation firms, of course, may need to be involved if you have PR concerns, or if you need legal counsel related to the breach, so those fees can be covered as part of your policy, as well as specifically mentioned before, notification fees if you are required to notify individuals that their data has been breached as a result of a security incident. There may also be third-party damages, and this can get into a very complex web of who is responsible for what, but foundational takeaway here, payment of damages and claims if there are third-party issues that arise out of a security failure resulting from an exploit of a system like your Exchange server or like a business email compromise. So if another party is impacted by an exploit of one of your resources, coverage for that is also available. So a great question here from an anonymous attendee. Couldn't Microsoft get hacked and all of their customer data be compromised hypothetically? Why is it more secure than on-prem? Absolutely, it could. So we do, as I mentioned before, cost-benefit kind of trade-offs and look at that cost-benefit balance, if you will. Yes, Microsoft being a single point of attack could potentially be breached and all of their data be compromised. From a technical standpoint, they have multiple layers of security in place to prevent something like that. They use what is known as defense in depth. And they have also architected many of their systems with the mindset of it's not if they get breached, however, it is when. So even if someone gets access to an administrative console in Microsoft 365, Microsoft has designed that service such that they would not be able to see all of the email accounts, all of the data that is held in email across all of Microsoft 365. So it's known as a resilient architecture, sometimes also known as fail secure. Even if something goes wrong, the entire security is not compromised. Of course, one organization hosting their own email server has one set of resources available to protect it. Microsoft, again, has thousands of security engineers. So I would argue that they also have more tools in their tool belt. Jen, I think we can go on to the next slide. Final thought on getting in touch with Coalition. If you do believe that you have an issue, you can always reach out to us 24/7. You can reach us on our emergency claims hotline, the number here, 833-866-1337. You can also email the claims at coalitioninc.com or claims@coalitioninc.ca. We also have a chat on our website. So if you are on the Coalition website, you see the red arrow here pointing to the little chat bubble in the lower right-hand corner. You can open a chat conversation and get routed to the appropriate folks who need help, who need to respond to help you out with whatever you might be facing, whether that's claim, technical help, or security recommendations. I think it's time to move on to questions. So down in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window, you have both the chat as well as the Q&A. You can ask a question in either. I've got those open. And I think I'll go ahead and scroll through here. I saw a couple that came in. Is Barracuda a good product? Can't really offer a product recommendation or endorsement per se. Barracuda does have a good reputation as a security provider for both email as well as network security. So definitely don't have any reason to say don't consider them. Obviously, make sure that you're looking at multiple options to get the best fit for your security tools. I'm going to hope I pronounce this correctly, Elnaz. Is there any platform to use instead of email for business communication, like sending invoices and sensitive data? Great question. I often encourage people to move things out of email into dedicated systems. So if you have an invoicing system, rather than emailing invoices back and forth, users should have a username and password, and hopefully multi-factor authentication to log into that invoicing system and transact their business directly there. If you have support requests that are coming in through email, moving that into a ticketing system, something like Jira or Remedy, rather than dealing with those incoming details via email. Of course, there are costs associated there. There's also some flexibility available in email, which those more rigid systems, an invoicing system will only have a set number of fields that people can fill out. So if there is unusual or information that is unpredictable, email, unfortunately, may be your best bet. Casey, great question. Which is more secure, on-prem or 365? I'm going to put on the auditor hat that I used to wear earlier in my career and say it depends. A dedicated on-prem 2016 Exchange server with a dedicated admin as well as a security program, I would say is comparable to Microsoft 365 in terms of security. Of course, it is also going to be much more costly because you have to pay for those resources dedicated in your organization versus sharing those resources through Microsoft with the other Microsoft 365 users. So ultimately, it comes down to how much you want to pay for it. Laura, I've seen some great stuff from you. Not sure that I see a question here so much as comments, all of which I agree with. Network devices, including peripherals connecting to Exchange servers. One of the reasons that we're recommending, trying to move things to cloud hosting, mostly for the security, but also for the opportunity to figure out what's communicating with your Exchange server and if it really needs to be communicating or not. Jamie, looks like a question here. Can I comment on how this type of service may enhance baseline Microsoft 365 security? So using Barracuda. Using Barracuda, Proofpoint, Mimecast, any of those email proxies will basically filter your emails. It provides an extra layer of defense on both incoming as well as outgoing emails to identify if somebody has sent a potentially malicious email, if an internal mailbox has been compromised and a large volume of potentially malicious emails are being sent out. So those are services that are not necessarily part of Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace. So in that case, if that level of security is appropriate for you, I think the enhancement there is basically you get an extra control, you get an extra layer of defense. As a security person, of course, I always want that. As someone who also has managed a budget, I recognize I can't always have everything that I want. Chris, what is the process of how someone infiltrates an email? If you don't open it, does phishing still work? If you don't open the email, obviously phishing will not work. Unfortunately, phishing is not just email. We often also see phishing done through the use of malicious websites that look like something legitimate and ask users to log in. So once people have access to the username and password needed to log into your inbox, needed to log into your webmail, that effectively means that email account has been compromised. So that's what that actually looks like, infiltrate, as you said. In many cases, we will see this as well, not necessarily an active phishing, but we can also you can also be compromised passively if you reuse passwords. So if you use your work email address and the same password that you use to log into your work email or your work laptop, if you use that on another service, like to sign up for LinkedIn, let's say, if LinkedIn suffers a data breach, they lose control of usernames and passwords. One of the automated tools that attackers will use is try that list of usernames and passwords across a variety of services to see if they can log in using that email password combo. That's known as credential stuffing. And again, that can be automated so they can try hundreds, if not thousands of these per second. Gary, my thoughts are that if you are sharing sensitive information, email is not the right way to do it. So an email add-on like ShareFile, email add-ons like the setup in Google Workspace, where you can, instead of sharing an attachment, you share a link to a document in Google Drive, obviously allows you a little bit more access control. I am 100% in support of those if you are sharing sensitive info.
Well, we covered a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone, for submitting and for the really thoughtful questions throughout. I wanted to mention one other thing that came up a couple times in the chat, not in the open Q&A. We had a few people ask about security services and consulting services, and if we could offer any recommendations there. And we do offer some services for policyholders, for free as part of your purchase from Coalition, but we also can make recommendations for folks in your area who have been vetted and we would recommend for security services as well. And so we'll follow up with some more information about that for anyone who needs a recommendation, and we're always happy to help there. And Aaron, before we close, got a couple more questions in around password sharing and security awareness training. So why don't we close out with those two?
Great. I was going to say, definitely wanted to make sure I addressed one of them. To the anonymous person who asked about security awareness training, I absolutely recommend it. It is also part of your coalition cyber policy. We partner with a company called Curricula who does some great training. You have 15 user signups included as part of your policy, and then discounted rate for any additional users. And they do monthly short computer-based training. Highly recommend it. Unfortunately, your users are the weakest point of your organization, but they can also be your strongest security asset. Lynn, any recommendations for password sharing via email? Absolutely 100%. Never, ever, under any circumstances, upon pain of death, ever do this, please. Password sharing should only be done securely. If you must share a password manager is a great solution. So you can actually control the access to that shared password. If you have to share a password with someone and you don't have a password manager, doing it in any format that does not leave a trail, calling them and reading the password is a good example of that. A secure messaging service as well could potentially be useful. So if you have something like Microsoft Teams where you can share a message that you know the data is encrypted and only internal. But yeah, sharing passwords via email is one of the cardinal no-nos in security. Great question.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for the thoughtful questions throughout. And we covered a lot of ground. And obviously this is a topic where it's just so critical to invest in your email security for all the reasons that Aaron mentioned of sort of the criticality of email for business communications and for how much we rely on email for all of our operations. And so I want to thank you for spending time learning more about this and for your diligence in keeping your organization secure. So I want to just plug one more time the cybersecurity guide, which we will send as an attachment to all of you who registered and joined this webinar. So thank you again for making the time. You can also access it from this link, so coalitioninc.com/cybersecurity-guide. But again, we'll follow up with the document itself in our follow-up email. And thank you again for making the time. I just want to close out with our ways that you can get in contact with us. So feel free to contact us anytime at help@coalitioninc.com or through the phone number toll-free listed at the bottom of the screen. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much for facilitating, Jen. And thank you all for attending.